My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 33 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in October of 2024, I sat inside a courtroom on the second floor of the Harlow County Courthouse and listened to both of my parents tell a judge that I was worthless. That I had always been worthless. That I did not deserve a single penny from the grandmother who was the only person in my entire family who had ever truly loved me. I sat at the table on the left side of that courtroom with my hands folded neatly in front of me. My attorney, Daniel Mercer, was beside me, his pen resting across a yellow legal pad covered in careful notes. On the other side of the aisle, my parents sat with their attorney, a man named Victor Kane, who had driven in from Atlanta and who, I would soon learn, had absolutely no idea what he had walked into. My father, Robert Calloway, was 58 years old. He was wearing a suit jacket that pulled too tight across his shoulders and a tie that was crooked by about 15 degrees. He sat with his arms folded and his jaw tight, the way he always sat when he was trying to look like a man in control. My mother, Patricia Calloway, was 56, and she sat with her back perfectly straight and her chin tilted just slightly upward, the posture she had practiced her whole life when she wanted the world to believe she was above everything around her. Behind them in the first row of the gallery sat my older brother Marcus, who was 36 and looked like he hadn't slept in days, and my younger sister Brianna, who was 28 and had barely looked up from her phone since she walked in. The two of them had come to support my parents, which meant they had come to stand against me. That was nothing new. They had been standing against me, or more accurately standing in front of me, my entire life. The case was listed as Calloway versus Calloway. It was a will contest. My grandmother, Eleanor Hartwell, had passed away 7 months earlier at the age of 82. She had left behind her home on Gardenside Street, a savings account with just over $210,000 in it, and a small collection of antique furniture that had been in the family for 3 generations. In her will, she had left everything to me. Every last piece of it. And when my parents found out, they lost their minds. Now, before I tell you about what happened inside that courtroom, and about the 4 words a judge spoke that made my mother go pale and my father grip the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, I need to take you back. Because this story didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in a 3-bedroom house on Belmont Street on the south side of town, where I grew up feeling like a guest in my own family. And if any part of what I just described sounds familiar to you, if you've ever been the child who was overlooked, the sibling who was invisible, the person who was told they would never amount to anything by the people who were supposed to believe in them first, I want you to stay with me. Because this story is for you. And before we go any further, if you've ever felt unseen by the people who should have seen you most clearly, please take a second right now and subscribe to this channel. The stories we share here exist for exactly that reason. For the people who needed someone to tell them they were never what those voices said they were. Hit subscribe, and let's keep going. My father worked as a maintenance supervisor at a shipping warehouse near the port. He left the house early and came home smelling like grease and cardboard, tired and irritable, with no patience left for anyone. My mother worked part-time at a dry cleaning shop, picking up afternoon shifts while we were at school. They made just enough money to keep the lights on. We were the kind of family that lived paycheck to paycheck and dressed it up as something else. There were 3 of us children. Marcus was the oldest, born 3 years before me. I was in the middle. And then Brianna, who came 5 years after I did. From as far back as I can remember, the way my parents treated the 3 of us was not just unequal. It was not even in the same universe of equal. Marcus was the golden child. He was the firstborn, the only son, and in the eyes of my father, that meant he was royalty. Whatever Marcus wanted, Marcus got. When he wanted to play football in 7th grade, my father found money for cleats and shoulder pads. That same month, he told me I couldn't go on a school field trip because the $25 fee was too much. When Marcus brought home failing grades, my father would shrug and say boys were boys. When I brought home a B+, my mother would glance at it and say nothing, as if average was the ceiling she had already assigned me. Brianna was the baby. Small and pretty, with my mother completely wrapped around her finger from the day she was born. My mother dressed her up and bragged about her to the neighbors. She took her shopping on weekends while I stayed home and did chores. Brianna was the daughter my mother wanted to show off. I was the daughter my mother barely remembered to introduce. And then there was me. Sarah. The middle child. The quiet one. The one who sat at the dinner table and listened to my parents talk about the future of Marcus and the cuteness of Brianna while I pushed peas around my plate and wondered if anyone would notice if I just got up and walked out. The answer, by the way, was no. They would not have noticed. I want to be clear about something. My parents didn't hit me. They didn't starve me. They didn't do anything that would make a social worker show up at the door. What they did was more subtle than that, and in some ways more damaging. They made me invisible. They made me feel like I was an accident. A filler child. A placeholder between the son they were proud of and the daughter they adored. I existed in that house the way a piece of furniture exists. Something that takes up space but never draws attention. I learned to take care of myself early. When I needed school supplies, I found ways to stretch what I had. When I needed help with homework, I walked to the public library and figured it out on my own. When I was sad or lonely or couldn't understand why my parents didn't love me the way they loved Marcus and Brianna, I sat on the back steps of the house and stared at the sky and told myself that one day, things would be different. The one person in my family who saw me, truly saw me, was my grandmother. Eleanor Hartwell was my mother's mother. And she was nothing like her daughter. She was warm where my mother was cold. Attentive where my mother was distracted. She lived alone in a beautiful little house on Gardenside Street, about 20 minutes from us. And every other Saturday, she would invite me over for lunch. Just me. Not Marcus. Not Brianna. Just me. She made him sandwiches and sweet tea, and we would sit on her front porch and she would ask me about school, about my dreams, about what I wanted to be when I grew up. And she listened to my answers like they actually mattered. Like I actually mattered. The summer before my senior year of high school was when the favoritism in my family crossed a line I couldn't ignore anymore. Marcus had just turned 20 and was living at home after dropping out of community college for the second time. No job. No ambition. No interest in doing anything except sleeping until noon and hanging around with his friends. My parents treated him like he was simply going through a rough patch. Like he was one good break away from turning his life around. That summer, my father took out a personal loan for $8,000. I know the exact amount because I heard him and my mother arguing about it one night through the thin wall between their bedroom and mine. The money was for Marcus. My father wanted to help him start a landscaping business, even though Marcus had never mowed a lawn voluntarily in his life and had shown zero interest in manual labor of any kind. My mother thought it was too much money. My father insisted. He said Marcus just needed a chance. He said someone needed to believe in him. No one had ever said that about me. The landscaping business lasted exactly 3 months. Marcus bought a used truck, picked up 2 or 3 small jobs, and then lost interest. The truck ended up parked in the driveway with a flat tire. The equipment sat in the garage collecting dust. My father absorbed the loss the way he absorbed every one of Marcus's failures. Quietly, and without consequence. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs. I bussed tables at a seafood restaurant 4 nights a week and worked Saturday mornings at a bookstore in the city center. I saved every dollar I could because I already knew that when the time came for me to leave, no one was going to hand me anything. And that same summer, I applied to a pre-law program at a state university about 2 hours away. I paid for it myself, using money I had earned at the restaurant. I took a bus to the program with a duffel bag and a notebook, and spent 3 weeks learning about constitutional law, trial advocacy, and legal writing from professors who looked at me like I had a brain worth investing in. It was the first time in my life that people in a position of authority treated me that way. When I came home, I was different. Something had opened up inside me. A clarity I hadn't had before. I walked into the house with my duffel bag over my shoulder, and nobody asked how the program went. My father was watching television. My mother was on the phone with her sister. Brianna was in her room. Marcus was asleep. I stood in the living room for a full minute waiting for someone to acknowledge that I had been gone for 3 weeks. And when no one did, I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed in the silence. My grandmother must have sensed that I was struggling, because she started calling me more often after that. Not just every other Saturday, but sometimes during the week as well. We would sit on her porch and she would tell me stories about her own life, about growing up in rural Georgia, about marrying my grandfather and building something with him before he passed. And one afternoon she said something I carry with me to this day. She said, "Sarah, the people who don't see your value are not the ones who get to assign it. You are not invisible. You are just standing in a room full of people who forgot to open their eyes." I cried when she said that. Not politely. The kind of crying where your whole body shakes because you have been holding everything inside for so long that when someone finally says the one thing you needed to hear, you don't have any defense left. She held me and rubbed my back and told me I was going to do extraordinary things. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. Because she was the only person who had never lied to me. My senior year of high school was a blur of classes, work shifts, and college applications. I applied to 6 schools and got into 4. I chose a state university in Atlanta because they offered me a partial scholarship and because it was far enough away from home that I could breathe without feeling the weight of my family pressing down on my chest. When I told my parents I was going to college in Atlanta, my mother looked at me and said, "And who is paying for that?" I told her I had a scholarship and savings from my 2 jobs. She made a short, dismissive sound that told me clearly she didn't believe I could pull it off. My father said nothing. He turned a page in his newspaper. Marcus, who was sitting on the couch with his feet up, said, "Good luck with that," in a tone that made clear he thought I was delusional. Only Brianna, 13 at the time, looked up at me with something resembling real interest. She said, "Are you really leaving?" When I said yes, she nodded once and went back to what she was doing. That was the closest anyone in my immediate family came to acknowledging that I was about to take the biggest step of my life. The day I left for Atlanta, nobody drove me to the station. I carried my 2 suitcases down Belmont Street to the corner, caught a city bus to the terminal, and climbed onto the coach alone. My grandmother had come to the house the night before and slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside was a card with a handwritten note and $500 in cash. The note said, "For the girl who is going to change the world. I love you, Sarah. Always. Grandma Eleanor." I held that card against my chest in the bus seat and watched the city shrink in the window behind me. And I made another promise to myself. I promised that no matter what happened, I would not come back to that house as the same girl who had left it. I would come back as someone who had built something. Someone who didn't need the approval of people who had never bothered to give it. I didn't know it then, but I wouldn't step foot inside that house on Belmont Street for almost a decade. And when I finally did, it would not be because I was welcomed back. It would be because I was summoned. The way you summon someone you want something from. Not someone you love. But that part comes later. Atlanta hit me like a wall. I arrived in August with 2 suitcases, $500, and a partial scholarship that covered about 60% of my tuition. The rest I had to figure out on my own. There was no safety net. No parent on the other end of the phone saying, "Call me if you need anything." I was 18 years old and completely alone in a city of 5 million people, and the reality of that sat on my shoulders like a concrete slab. I rented a small room in a shared apartment near campus. It was barely big enough for a twin mattress and a desk, but it had a door that locked and a window that let in sunlight. After sharing a room with Brianna for 13 years, having my own space felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. I found 2 jobs within my first week. Mornings at a coffee shop 6 blocks from campus, where I opened the store at 5 a.m. and served espresso to business people who never made eye contact. Evenings at a small accounting firm downtown, answering phones and filing paperwork from 4 to 8. Between those jobs and my class schedule, I ran on about 5 hours of sleep a night. I won't romanticize those years. They were brutal. There were weeks when I had to choose between textbooks and groceries. There were nights when I sat at my tiny desk staring at assignments I didn't understand, wishing I had someone to call. My grandmother always answered when I did call, and she always listened, and she always told me she was proud of me. But even she couldn't fill the hole that my parents had carved into me over 18 years of being overlooked. I remember one particular night during my sophomore year. I was sitting on the floor of my room at 2 a.m, surrounded by law textbooks, when my mother called. It was the first time she had called me in months. For a split second, my heart jumped. Maybe she was checking on me. Maybe something had changed. She was calling to ask for money. Marcus had gotten into some kind of trouble involving a bar fight and a broken window, and they needed $500 for a lawyer. She said it matter-of-factly, as if asking me for money was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't ask how my classes were going. She didn't ask if I was eating. She didn't ask a single question about my life. I told her I didn't have $500 to spare, which was the truth. She sighed, said, "I figured as much," and hung up. The entire call lasted less than 3 minutes. I sat on that floor for a long time afterward, holding the phone, asking myself if there would ever come a day when my parents contacted me for a reason that had nothing to do with what I could give them. Despite everything, I excelled. Not because I was naturally brilliant, but because I understood that education was the only ladder I had, and I was not about to let go of it. I graduated in 3.5 years with a degree in political science and a growing certainty that law school was where I needed to be. I applied to one of the Southeast's most prestigious law schools on a whim, convinced I would not get in. What I had was a personal statement that told the truth about who I was, a strong academic record, and 3 letters from professors who had watched me work 2 jobs and a full course load without ever making an excuse. I got in. When I opened the acceptance email, I was standing behind the coffee shop counter in the middle of the morning rush. I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I walked into the back room and cried. My manager found me and I showed her the email on my phone and she hugged me and said, "Girl, you better go be a lawyer." I called my grandmother that night. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She said, "I knew it. I knew it from the day you were born. You were always the one, Sarah." I did not call my parents. There was no point. And right now, if you're watching this and you're in the middle of your own version of that moment, working 2 jobs, doubting yourself, waiting for someone to believe in you before you believe in yourself, I want you to know something. The people who didn't cheer for you when you got in are not the reason you got there. You got there because of you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are in your story right now. Even if it's just still fighting. Those 2 words are enough. I read every single one. Law school was 3 years of the hardest, most clarifying work of my life. I studied contracts, torts, constitutional law, civil procedure, and evidence. During my 2nd year, I discovered that family law was where my heart lived. Something about the intersection of law and family, the way legal decisions could protect vulnerable people or fail them entirely, spoke to something deep inside me. I saw myself in the cases I studied. The forgotten children. The overlooked siblings. The family members pushed aside by systems that rewarded favoritism and ignored fairness. I graduated in the top 15% of my class. Passed the bar on my first attempt. And then I did something that surprised even me. I moved back home. Not to reconcile. Not to go back to that house on Belmont Street. I moved back because my city had shaped me, for better and for worse, and I wanted to practice law in the place where I had first learned what injustice felt like. I wanted to stand in those courtrooms and be the person that people like me came looking for when they needed someone in their corner. I joined a small family law firm run by a woman named Catherine Marsh, who had been practicing law there for 30 years. Tough, sharp, deeply committed to her clients. She hired me on the spot after my interview and later told me I reminded her of herself at 25. I threw myself into the work. I took on every case I could, stayed late, prepared obsessively, and built a reputation in the local legal community as someone who was thorough, compassionate, and impossible to rattle in court. By the time I was 28, I had become one of the most respected family law attorneys in the city. I wasn't advertised. I didn't seek attention. I just did the work, case after case, and let the results speak for themselves. Judges knew my name. Opposing counsel knew my reputation. And the people I helped, the mothers and fathers and children whose lives I fought for, they knew my heart. My parents had no idea. They didn't know I had gone to law school. They didn't know I had passed the bar. They didn't know I was practicing law in the same city where they still lived. We hadn't spoken in years, and they had never once tried to find out what I was doing with my life. As far as they were concerned, I was still the quiet, useless girl who had left for Atlanta and disappeared. They were wrong. And they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The year I turned 29, I left my firm and opened my own practice. I started with one paralegal, a woman named Vanessa Cole, who had worked alongside me for 2 years and believed completely in what I was trying to do. We had no fancy furniture, no marketing budget, no name recognition beyond the legal circles I'd already moved in. We had 2 desks, a coffee maker, a filing cabinet, and a relentless commitment to doing good work. Within 6 months, the phone was ringing constantly. Referrals came from former clients, from other attorneys, from judges who quietly recommended me to people who walked into their courtrooms lost and afraid. I took on clients who could pay and clients who could not. Because I had made a decision early on that money would never be the reason someone didn't get the representation they deserved. That conviction was what led me to create the Hartwell Legal Foundation. I named it after my grandmother because she was the one who taught me that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. The foundation provided free legal services to children in the foster care system, to parents fighting wrongful custody decisions, and to victims of domestic violence who couldn't afford an attorney. I funded it initially from my own practice, and within a year I had secured 2 grants and a significant donation from a local business owner who had read about my work in the city paper. That article, written by a reporter named Diana Reeves, ran on a Sunday morning and told enough of my story to reach people who saw themselves in it. It talked about my childhood, my years working through college, and the foundation I had built. It didn't name my parents or my siblings because I had asked Diana to leave them out. Even after everything, I didn't want to humiliate them publicly. That instinct, the instinct to protect people who had never protected me, was something I was still working to understand about myself. The article went wide. Hundreds of messages came in from people across the state and beyond. People who had been invisible child. The overlooked one. The one told they would never amount to anything. Some cried in their messages. Some asked for help. I responded to as many as I could. In the 2 years that followed, the Hartwell Legal Foundation grew beyond anything I had imagined. 3 more attorneys joined the team. We expanded into a larger office and partnered with 2 family shelters in the metro area. We handled over 400 cases in our first full year of operation. I was invited to speak at legal conferences and at community events, and at the same state university that had hosted the pre-law program I attended as a teenager. I stood on that stage and told a room full of young people that the voice in their head telling them they are not enough is lying. The room gave me a standing ovation. I was also honored by the local bar association with the Community Service Award that year, an award given to one attorney who demonstrates exceptional commitment to public service. The judge who presented the award was a senior figure in the County Superior Court, a woman named Judge Margaret Holloway. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for fairness that was known throughout the state. She shook my hand at the podium and said in front of 300 people, "Sarah Calloway represents the very best of what this profession can be." I mentioned Judge Holloway because she would later play a role in the most important moment of my life. But at the time, I simply held that plaque and felt something I had never felt before. Validated. Not by my parents. Not by my family. By a community of people who had watched me work and decided I was worth recognizing. Now keep in mind, while all of this was happening, my family was going in the opposite direction. Marcus had bounced from job to job through his 30s. Construction for a while, then delivery driving, then another failed business venture. He was living in a rented apartment with a girlfriend who changed every few months. My parents continued to support him financially, sending money whenever he called, which was often. Brianna had married young, had a daughter named Harper, and when the marriage fell apart inside 2 years, she moved back in with my parents and settled into a life that looked almost identical to the one she'd had as a teenager. Dependent on my mother. Uninterested in building anything of her own. My parents, meanwhile, were aging and struggling. My father had been forced into early retirement after a back injury, and his disability payments barely covered the mortgage. My mother had stopped working entirely. The house on Belmont Street was falling apart. The roof leaked worse than ever. The plumbing was unreliable. They were not broke, but they were close. And the 2 children they had poured everything into were giving them nothing in return. I kept my distance. I kept building my practice and my foundation. I kept showing up for my clients. And I kept visiting my grandmother every chance I got, because she was the one person who had always shown up for me. Every Sunday I drove to Gardenside Street with lunch from her favorite deli on the east side of town. We would eat together on the front porch and she would ask about my cases, about the foundation, about my life. She followed everything I did with a fierce, specific pride. She cut out the newspaper article and taped it to her refrigerator. She kept the program from the Bar Association ceremony on her nightstand. She also told me things during those visits that I had never known before. She told me about the tension between herself and my mother, a tension that had existed for years. She said my mother had resented the relationship between me and her grandmother for a long time, because Eleanor openly favored me, even though my mother had been the one who created the conditions that made that favoritism necessary in the first place. Your mother decided you weren't enough before you were old enough to prove her wrong, my grandmother said one afternoon, her voice quiet but steady. And instead of admitting she was wrong, she doubled down. That is what small people do, Sarah. They would rather be consistent than correct. In the fall of 2023, my grandmother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Advanced. Limited treatment options. The oncologist asked us to prepare for the worst. I sat in that examination room holding her hand so tightly I thought I might crush it. 2 weeks later, I moved in. I set up in the guest bedroom on the second floor, reduced my caseload, and handed day-to-day operations of the office to Vanessa. I cooked for my grandmother, drove her to appointments, managed her medications, and sat beside her bed every night reading to her from the novels she loved. My parents knew she was sick. My mother visited once, early on, and stayed less than an hour. She sat in the living room and talked about herself. About how hard things had been for her and Robert. About the cost of living. About how Brianna was struggling. She didn't ask Eleanor how she was feeling. She didn't offer to help. She came, she talked, and she left. Marcus didn't visit at all. Brianna came once with Harper. And while Harper sat on the floor playing with a stuffed animal, Brianna stood in the doorway looking at her phone. Neither of them stayed more than 30 minutes. I was the one who was there. Every day. Every night. Through every difficult moment. When my grandmother was in pain, I held her hand. When she was afraid, I sat with her in the dark and told her stories about the cases I had won, about the families I had helped, about the future I was building because of everything she had taught me. She smiled every time. Even at the end, she smiled. And this is the part one needs you to understand, because it matters deeply to what happened later. I was not there because of money. I wasn't there because of the house. I didn't know what was in her will, and I didn't ask. I was there because she was the only person who had ever taken care of me. and I finally had the means to take care of her. That was all. In January of 2024, about 2 months before she passed, my grandmother asked me to call her attorney, a man named Raymond Doyle who had handled her legal affairs for over 20 years. She told me she wanted to update her will. I asked if she was sure, and she said she had never been more certain of anything in her life. I was not present for the conversation between her and Raymond. She asked me to leave the room, and I respected her wishes. I went downstairs, made tea, and waited. When Raymond came down 30 minutes later, he looked at me with a kind expression and said, "Your grandmother loves you very much, Sarah." I didn't ask what was in the will. It wasn't my place. And honestly, it didn't matter to me. Not then. Stop right here. Because what I'm about to tell you is the reason I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, before we go any further. What happened over the next 9 months is a story about what it looks like when the people who wrote you off are forced to sit in a room and reckon with what you actually became. And if you want to see stories like this, stories about real people fighting for what they deserve, stories that remind you why it matters to keep going even when no one is clapping, this is the channel for that. Subscribe. We're just getting to the part that changed everything. Eleanor Hartwell passed away on the 14th of March, 2024, at 6:47 in the morning, in her bed on Gardenside Street. I was sitting beside her, holding her hand. She had stopped talking 2 days earlier, but in her final moments, she squeezed my fingers so slightly I almost missed it. And then she was gone. I sat with her for a long time after. Just the two of us in the quiet of that room, the birds beginning outside her window, the city still waking up. The grief was too big for tears at first. It sat inside me like a stone, heavy and immovable. I called Raymond. I called the funeral home. I called Vanessa. And then, because I felt like I had to, I called my mother. She answered on the third ring. I told her that Eleanor had passed. There was a pause. And then she said, "Well, I suppose we need to figure out the house situation." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" Her mother had just died, and the first thing she thought about was the house. I hung up without responding. The funeral was held 5 days later. I organized everything. I chose the flowers, the music, the readings. I wrote the eulogy. My parents came dressed in black, wearing expressions of practiced solemnity that didn't match the disinterest they had shown during the final months of my grandmother's life. Marcus and Brianna came too, standing in the back, present in body if not in spirit. I stood at the podium and spoke about the woman who had saved my life without ever raising her voice. I told the room about the Saturday lunches and the porch conversations and the $500 in the envelope with the note that said, "For the girl who is going to change the world." I didn't mention my parents. I didn't need to. The absence of their love for Eleanor was already speaking for itself. After the service, Raymond approached me and said we needed to schedule the reading of the will. He said he would handle everything and that all relevant parties would be notified. I nodded, thanked him, and went home to a house that was now unbearably quiet. I didn't know that my grandmother had left everything to me. And I certainly didn't know that her final act of love would be the thing that dragged me into a courtroom and forced me to face the family that had thrown me away. The reading of the will took place at Raymond Doyle's office on Bay Street. It was a warm spring morning. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a navy dress. My parents were already there. The moment I walked in, I felt the temperature of the room change. My father was sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Raymond's desk, his arms folded, his jaw tight. My mother sat beside him, her purse clutched in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Neither of them acknowledged me when I walked in. Marcus and Brianna hadn't come. My mother later told the court they hadn't been notified, but Raymond had sent letters to every member of the family. The truth was simpler. They simply didn't care enough to show up. They would care later, once they learned what was at stake. Raymond read the will. It was straightforward. My grandmother had left the house on Gardenside Street and all its contents to me. The savings account, which at the time of her death held approximately $210,000, to me. The antique furniture collection, appraised at roughly $45,000, to me. And a personal letter addressed to me, which Raymond handed across the desk in a sealed envelope. To my parents, she had left nothing. The will contained a brief explanatory statement that Raymond had advised her to include. It read, "I leave my estate to my granddaughter, Sarah, because she is the one who showed up. She is the one who cared. She is the one who sat with me, laughed with me, and held my hand when I was afraid. My daughter and the rest of my family had every opportunity to be present in my life. They chose not to be. I do not make this decision out of anger. I make it out of love for the one person who earned it." My mother stood up before Raymond had finished reading the statement. Her face was red. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was a pitch higher than normal when she said, "This is ridiculous." She manipulated her. Sarah took advantage of a sick old woman and turned her against her own daughter. My father slammed his hand on the arm of his chair. He said that house had been in the family for decades. That you didn't just hand it over because someone showed up a few times with sandwiches. I sat there and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with my parents was like shouting into a hurricane. I let them rage. I let them accuse me. And when they were done, I asked Raymond if there was anything else I needed to sign. I opened the letter from my grandmother that night, sitting on her porch, in the chair where she used to sit. 2 pages, written in her careful, slightly shaky handwriting. I won't share every word here. Some things are too sacred to speak out loud. But she told me she was proud of me. She said she had watched me grow into the woman she always knew I could be. She said she was sorry that my parents had never seen me. And she said something that proved to be prophetic. She wrote, "They will fight you for this, Sarah. They will say things about you that are not true. But you already know who you are. Do not let them take that from you." She was right. Within 3 weeks, my parents filed a formal contest of the will in the county probate court. Their claim was that I had exercised undue influence over Eleanor during the final months of her life. That I had isolated her from the rest of the family. That I had used my legal expertise to coerce her into changing her will to benefit me exclusively. They also argued that Eleanor had lacked the mental capacity to make sound legal decisions at the time the will was drafted. Every single one of those claims was false. I had not isolated my grandmother from anyone. The rest of the family had isolated themselves by choosing not to visit, not to call, and not to care. Eleanor had been mentally sharp until the very end. Her oncologist would later confirm this in a written declaration. And the decision to change her will had been entirely hers, made freely, without any pressure from me. But my parents didn't care about the truth. They cared about the money, the house, and the fact that the daughter they had dismissed their entire lives had been chosen over them by the one person whose opinion had ever mattered. They hired Victor Kane, an attorney from Atlanta who specialized in estate disputes and who had a reputation for being aggressive and theatrical in court. I later learned they had found him through Marcus, who had a friend who had used Kane in a property dispute. The fact that Kane was not from this city and was unfamiliar with the local legal community would turn out to be one of the most consequential details in this entire case. When I received the formal notice of the will contest, I sat in my office and read it carefully, line by line. Then I called Daniel Mercer. Daniel was a probate attorney I had worked with on several cases through the foundation. Meticulous, calm under pressure, deeply familiar with county judges. I asked if he would represent me, and he said yes without hesitation. He told me over the phone, "They're going to try to make this personal, Sarah. They're going to try to put your character on trial. You know that, right?" I said I knew. He asked if I was okay with that. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the years of silence. The ignored accomplishments. The dismissals. The rejection. I thought about the note from my grandmother. And I thought about the promise I had made to myself at 17 on the back porch of that house on Belmont Street. The promise to never let them define me. I'm okay with it, I said. Because they don't know who they're fighting. The 6 months between the filing and the hearing were some of the longest of my life. Daniel handled the procedural side with quiet efficiency. He gathered medical records from Eleanor's oncologist, testimony from Raymond Doyle, records of family visitation, and built a timeline that clearly showed who had been present in my grandmother's life and who had not. He also prepared a character defense for me, though I told him I hoped it wouldn't come to that. What wasn't manageable was the emotional weight. I was being sued by my own parents. The people who brought me into the world. Every time I read a document from Kane's office, every time I saw the words undue influence or exploitation of a vulnerable elder, I felt something crack inside me. Not because the accusations were true, but because they came from the two people whose approval I had spent half my life trying to earn and the other half trying to forget I wanted. Vanessa Cole was my anchor during those months. She came over most evenings with takeout and company, sitting across from me at the kitchen table and refusing to let me drown in my own thoughts. She had been with me since the beginning of my practice, and she knew me well enough to know when I needed to talk and when I just needed someone to be there. One evening she said, "They are not going to win. The evidence is on your side. The law is on your side. And the judge, if you described her correctly, already knows exactly who you are." I said that wasn't what I was worried about. She asked what it was then. I looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of my grandmother and me at my law school graduation, both of us smiling so wide it looked like our faces might crack. "I'm worried about what it means that it came to this," I said. "That my own parents would rather fight me in court than admit they were wrong." Vanessa put down her fork and looked at me. "Maria, they have been wrong about you your entire life. This is just the legal version of what they've been doing since you were a kid. The only difference is that now there's a record." She was right. I knew it. But knowing something and feeling it are two entirely different things. The night before the hearing, I sat on the porch of the house on Gardenside Street and read the letter from my grandmother one more time. I traced her handwriting with my finger and whispered, "I will not let them take what you gave me, Grandma. Not the house, not the money. And not the way you made me feel about myself." The gardenias in the ceramic pot on the porch were blooming. The air was warm and thick with the smell of them. I closed my eyes and imagined her sitting in the rocking chair beside me. "You already know who you are, Sarah." I did. I went inside, set my alarm for 6 in the morning, laid out my clothes for court, and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. But when the alarm went off, I got up, showered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and a white blouse, pinned my hair back, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the girl from Belmont Street. She was not the invisible middle child. She was not the one who used to sit on the back steps talking to a stray cat because no one else would listen. She was Sarah Calloway. Attorney. Founder. Advocate. Granddaughter. And she was ready. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30, half an hour before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Daniel and I took our seats at the table on the left side of the courtroom and arranged our documents. He was calm, organized, focused. He had done this hundreds of times. I had appeared in this room dozens of times as an attorney. But sitting at that table as the party, as the person on trial, felt completely different. My parents arrived at 8:45 with Victor Kane. My father walked in first, his suit too tight, his posture rigid. My mother followed, clutching a tissue in one hand and the strap of her purse in the other. They took their seats without looking at me. Kane, a tall man in his mid-50s with silver hair and an expensive watch, settled in beside them and opened his briefcase with the particular confidence of a man who had already decided how this would go. Marcus and Brianna arrived a few minutes later and sat in the front row of the gallery. Brianna was in a dress that looked like she had pulled it from the back of a closet. Neither of them acknowledged my presence. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Margaret Holloway entered. Black robe. Silver hair pulled back. Reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She took her seat on the bench, reviewed the file in front of her for a moment, and then looked up. She stated the case number, confirmed representation on both sides, and invited Victor Kane to present. Kane walked to the podium with practiced confidence. He began by summarizing the claim. That Eleanor Hartwell had been elderly and ill. That Sarah Calloway had moved into her home during her final months. That Sarah had used her position as a caretaker and her legal expertise to exert undue influence over the decedent. And that the will should be invalidated so the estate could be distributed to the rightful heirs, meaning my parents. He called my father as his first witness. My father took the stand, sat stiffly, and answered Kane's questions in short, rehearsed sentences. He described his relationship with Eleanor as close. He described visits that had been sporadic at best and absent at worst. He described holidays where my grandmother had sometimes been invited and often left sitting alone in a corner. And then Kane shifted to questions about me. He asked my father to describe my relationship with Eleanor. My father leaned forward slightly. He said I had always done my own thing. That I moved away young. That I didn't keep in touch with the family. That when Eleanor got sick, I showed up and moved in, and after that, the rest of the family wasn't welcome anymore. Kane asked if he would say I had isolated Eleanor from the family. That is exactly what she did, my father said. Daniel objected. The judge sustained it. But the narrative was being built. Sarah, the estranged daughter, had swooped in at the end and stolen a dying woman from her family. Then Kane called my mother. Patricia Calloway took the stand with the kind of practiced composure I had watched her perform my entire life. A version of herself that didn't match who she was at home. She answered Kane's questions with a trembling voice that I recognized as manufactured. She dabbed at her eyes with the tissue even though no tears were falling. And then Kane asked her to describe the role I had played in the family. She said I had never been part of the family the way the others were. That I was always off on my own, always doing my own thing, never contributing, never being there when they needed me. And then she said it. She is just a useless daughter, Your Honor. She always has been. And now she has taken my mother from me, even in death. The words hung in the air like smoke. Useless daughter. Said plainly. Without hesitation. As if it were a fact as obvious as the color of the walls. My father nodded in agreement from the table. Marcus crossed his arms in the gallery and looked satisfied. Brianna, for the first time since she had walked in, put her phone down. I did not flinch. I did not react. I sat with my hands folded on the table and my eyes forward. I had heard those words before, in different forms, spoken in different rooms, over the course of my entire life. Hearing them in a courtroom, under oath, in front of a judge, did not surprise me. It only confirmed what I had always known. But then something shifted. I saw it in the face of Judge Holloway. She had been listening attentively throughout the testimony, making notes, maintaining the neutral expression that all good judges wear. But when my mother said those words, something changed behind her eyes. Her pen stopped moving. She looked up from her notes and stared at my mother for a long moment. Then she shifted her gaze to Victor Kane, who was standing at the podium looking pleased with the testimony he had just elicited. Judge Holloway removed her reading glasses and placed them on the bench. She folded her hands in front of her. And in a voice that was calm, measured, and carrying a weight that made every person in that room stop breathing, she spoke. Mr. Kane. Kane looked up. Yes, Your Honor. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Of course, Your Honor. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. Do you know who the respondent in this case is? Do you actually know who Sarah Calloway is? The smile on Kane's face faded. He blinked. He said she was the granddaughter of the decedent, the daughter of the petitioners. Judge Holloway did not blink. That is not what I asked. I asked if you know who she is. The courtroom went silent. The clerk stopped typing. The people in the gallery leaned forward. My parents, who had been sitting with their chins raised in self-righteous confidence, slowly turned their heads toward the bench. And Victor Kane stood at the podium, frozen, with no answer to give. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But it felt like it stretched across the entire history of my life. Every year spent being ignored. Every moment told I was not enough. Every holiday where no one saved me a seat at the table. Every phone call that never came. Every accomplishment that was never acknowledged. All of it compressed into the space between Judge Holloway's question and the blank expression on Kane's face. Judge Holloway did not wait for him to find his words. She turned to the courtroom at large and spoke clearly. Since it appears that counsel for the petitioners has not done his due diligence, allow me to clarify something for the record. She looked directly at Kane, then briefly at my parents. Sarah Calloway is one of the most accomplished attorneys practicing in this county. She is the founder of the Hartwell Legal Foundation, a nonprofit organization that has provided free legal representation to hundreds of families and children across this region. She has appeared in this courthouse numerous times before multiple judges, including myself, and has consistently demonstrated the highest standards of professionalism, integrity, and compassion. She paused. The courtroom was utterly still. In 2022, Ms. Calloway received the Bar Association's Community Service Award, which I personally presented to her at the annual ceremony. She is known throughout the legal community of this city not only for her exceptional work, but for her dedication to the most vulnerable members of our society. Children who have been neglected. Families who have been torn apart. People who have been overlooked by the very systems designed to protect them. Judge Holloway looked at my mother, who was still sitting in the witness chair, her face draining of color. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, addressing my mother. "The woman you have just described as useless is the same woman who has changed the lives of hundreds of people in this community. The same woman who has stood in this very courtroom and fought for justice. Not for profit. Because she believed it was the right thing to do. And she did all of that, every bit of it, without a single word of support or encouragement from you." My father had gone completely pale. His hands, which had been resting on the table, were now gripping the edge of it so tightly his knuckles were white. Marcus had uncrossed his arms and was sitting perfectly still, his mouth slightly open. And Brianna had put her phone face down on the seat beside her and was staring at the judge with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something between shock and shame. Victor Kane attempted to recover. He straightened his tie and said, with all due respect, that the professional accomplishments of the respondent were not relevant to the question of undue influence. Judge Holloway fixed him with a look that could have cut glass. "Mr. Kane, the character of the respondent is absolutely relevant when your clients have spent the last 30 minutes attempting to assassinate it. You have presented testimony describing Ms. Calloway as a negligent, absent, and useless member of this family. I am establishing for the record that those characterizations are not only unsupported by the evidence, but are contradicted by a well-documented record of accomplishment and service that is known to this court and to this community." Kane sat down. He did not attempt another objection. Judge Holloway turned to Daniel. "Mr. Mercer, you may present the case for the respondent." Daniel walked to the podium with the quiet confidence I had watched him carry into every courtroom. He didn't need to be theatrical. He had the truth. And the truth, when laid out clearly and without embellishment, is the most powerful argument there is. He started with the medical records from Eleanor's oncologist. The record showed that Eleanor had been mentally competent throughout her illness with no signs of cognitive impairment or confusion. Her physician submitted a written declaration confirming that Eleanor was lucid and capable of making her own decisions until the final days of her life. Daniel then presented testimony from Raymond Doyle, Eleanor's attorney, who appeared by video from his office. Raymond confirmed that Eleanor had contacted him of her own volition in January of 2024. That she had discussed her wishes clearly and without outside pressure. And that Sarah had not been present in the room during the drafting of the will. Daniel asked Raymond directly, was there any indication that Sarah Calloway had influenced or coerced Eleanor Hartwell in any way regarding the contents of the will? Raymond said, absolutely not. Eleanor was one of the most clear-minded clients I have ever had. She knew exactly what she wanted and why. She told me herself that she was leaving her estate to Sarah because Sarah was the only one who had been there for her. Those were her words, not mine. Daniel then presented the visitor log from Eleanor's home. I had kept it at Raymond's suggestion, documenting every visit my grandmother received during the last 6 months of her life. The log showed that I had been present every single day. It showed my mother had visited once, for 43 minutes. It showed Brianna had visited once, for 26 minutes. It showed that Marcus had never visited at all. And it showed that my father had never once set foot in the house. The contrast was devastating. My parents had claimed to be close to Eleanor. They had claimed I had isolated her from the family. The log told a different story, one supported by dates, times, and the handwritten notes of Eleanor herself, who had sometimes added comments to the entries. Next to one entry from September of 2023, she had written in her careful hand, Sarah brought chicken soup. We watched Jeopardy together. She is my heart. There was nothing written next to anyone else's name. Because no one else had come. Daniel also presented financial records showing that I had not received any money from Eleanor during her lifetime, that I had paid for several of her medical expenses out of my own pocket, and that I had continued to maintain the house, pay the utility bills, and cover the property taxes after her death. These were not the actions of someone who was trying to steal an inheritance. They were the actions of someone who genuinely loved and cared for another person. When Daniel finished and returned to his seat, he placed his hand briefly on my forearm. A gesture so subtle no one else would have noticed. But it steadied me. I took a breath. Judge Holloway spent several minutes reviewing the documents and her notes. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then she looked up. I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, she said, and I am prepared to issue my ruling. She looked at my parents, who were sitting at their table like two people who had just realized they were standing on the edge of a cliff. The petitioners have alleged that the respondent exercised undue influence over the decedent and that the will of Eleanor Hartwell should be invalidated. Having reviewed the medical evidence, the testimony of the drafting attorney, the visitor records, the financial documentation, and the testimony of the petitioners themselves, I find no credible evidence to support these claims. She paused. What I do find is the following. I find that Sarah Calloway was the primary caretaker of Eleanor Hartwell during the final months of her life. I find that she provided this care voluntarily, at significant personal and financial cost. I find that the rest of the family, including the petitioners, failed to maintain any meaningful presence in the life of the decedent during her illness. And I find that the will of Eleanor Hartwell was executed freely, without coercion, by a woman of sound mind who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Judge Holloway picked up her gavel. The petition to contest the will is denied. The estate of Eleanor Hartwell will be distributed in accordance with the terms of the will in its entirety to Sarah Calloway. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The sound rang through the courtroom like a bell. My mother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob and pressed the tissue to her mouth. My father stared at the table in front of him, motionless, as if the ruling had turned him to stone. Victor Kane gathered his papers without looking at his clients, already calculating his exit from a case he never should have taken. And I sat perfectly still, with my hands folded on the table, and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just a deep, quiet sadness that it had taken a courtroom and a judge to say out loud what my grandmother had been saying to me my entire life. I was not useless. I had never been useless. And the people who told me I was had just been proven wrong. Not by my words. By the record of my life. I walked out of the courtroom and down the marble stairs with Daniel beside me. Neither of us spoke. The morning light was pouring through the tall windows of the lobby, and when we pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped outside, the warm October air met us like a quiet reward. I stopped on the top step and breathed. Daniel put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Sarah." "My grandmother did good," I said. "I just showed up." He smiled, nodded, and said he'd be in touch within the week. I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched him walk toward the parking garage. Then I stood there alone on those steps for a while and let the morning settle around me. I didn't see my parents leave. Didn't see Marcus or Brianna. Didn't know if they had slipped out a side door or waited until I was gone. It didn't matter. The hearing was over. The will was upheld. And the words that had been spoken inside that courtroom, both the cruel ones from my mother and the clarifying ones from Judge Holloway, were now part of the permanent record. In the weeks that followed, I learned through Vanessa what happened on the other side of the case. Victor Kane submitted his final invoice and closed the file. The legal fees he charged my parents totaled just over $18,000. Money they could not afford. Money that deepened the financial hole they were already drowning in. Marcus predictably distanced himself from the situation and denied having been the one who connected them with Kane in the first place. My mother tried to call me once, about 2 weeks after the hearing. I saw her number on the screen and let it ring. She didn't leave a voicemail. I don't know what she would have said. I realized I didn't need to know. There was a time in my life when a call from my mother would have sent me spiraling into hope or into despair. But that time had passed. I was no longer the girl who waited by the door for someone to notice her. I was the woman who had built her own door and walked through it. And then, about a month after the ruling, Brianna did something that surprised me. She sent me a letter. Not an email. An actual handwritten letter, on paper, in an envelope. It was short. Just a few paragraphs. She didn't apologize for the lawsuit. She didn't ask for anything. She wrote that she had been thinking about what happened in that courtroom, about what Judge Holloway had said, and about everything she hadn't known about my life because she had never thought to ask. She wrote that her daughter Harper had just turned 5, and that she didn't want to raise her the way we had been raised. She said she was figuring out what that looked like. She asked, carefully, whether there might ever be room for something different between us. I read that letter 3 times. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for days, the way you sit with something that holds both old pain and new possibility at the same time. I haven't written back yet. But I haven't thrown the letter away, either. I keep it in the drawer of my desk, beneath the photograph of Eleanor and me at my law school graduation. I think about Harper sometimes. A little girl who deserves to grow up knowing what it looks like when a woman knows her own worth. Maybe that's something I can give her. Not yet. But maybe. I want to be honest about something before we close. Winning the case did not fix everything. It did not erase the years of being invisible. It did not heal the wound of being called useless by my own mother in a public courtroom. It did not fill the space that my grandmother left behind when she died. Grief doesn't work that way. Healing doesn't work that way. There is no single moment, no matter how dramatic or satisfying, that wipes the slate clean and makes everything okay. What the case gave me was clarity. It showed me in the starkest possible terms who my parents were and who they had always been. Not villains. Not monsters. Just people who were too small, too scared, and too set in their ways to see the value of their own child. People who, when confronted with the evidence of their failure, doubled down rather than changed. People who chose the easier path of favoritism over the harder work of loving equally. I do not hate them. I want to be clear about that. Hate is a heavy thing to carry, and I have spent too many years building the strength in my arms to waste it carrying that. What I feel for them now is something closer to distance. A calm, measured, permanent distance. The kind of space you create not out of anger but out of self-preservation. The kind of boundary you draw when you finally understand that some people are simply incapable of giving you what you need. Not because they don't have it, but because they have decided you are not worth giving it to. I kept the house on Gardenside Street. I live there now. I replaced the shutters, fixed the plumbing, and painted the rooms in the colors my grandmother always talked about wanting. Warm yellows and soft greens and a shade of blue for the guest bedroom that she once described as the color of the sky right before sunset. I kept her furniture, her photographs, and her rocking chairs. I kept the ceramic pot of gardenias on the porch because every time I walk past them on my way inside, I can still smell her. The Hartwell Legal Foundation is still growing. 5 attorneys now on staff, a full-time social worker, partnerships with 4 family shelters across the metro area. In 2024, we handled over 600 cases and helped more than 300 families navigate the legal system. We are building a mentorship program for young people aging out of the foster care system, a program I named the Eleanor Initiative, because my grandmother believed that every young person deserves someone in their corner. And for too many of them, no one is. I still practice law. I still show up in courtrooms across this county and fight for people who have been forgotten. I still sit across the table from clients who are scared and lost and uncertain. And I tell them what my grandmother told me. The people who don't see your value are not the ones who get to assign it. I am 33 years old. I am not married. I don't have children yet. But I have a life that is full. Full of purpose. Full of meaning. Full of the kind of love that you build for yourself when the love you were born into isn't enough. I have Vanessa, who is more than a colleague. She is a sister. I have Daniel, who showed me what it looks like when someone fights for you without being asked. I have the memory of my grandmother, which lives in every room of this house and every corner of my heart. And I have the truth. The truth that I am not useless. The truth that I never was. The truth that the people who said I was had simply run out of ways to explain why the daughter they ignored turned out to be the one worth paying attention to. My grandmother once told me that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who finally realizes her own worth. She said it with a smile, like she was letting me in on a secret. And she was right. Because once you know what you are worth, no courtroom, no insult, no family that failed you can ever take it away. If you're watching this and you see yourself in any part of this story, if you are the forgotten child, the overlooked sibling, the one who was told you would never amount to anything, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not what they said you are. You are not the story they wrote about you. You are not defined by the people who failed to love you properly. You are defined by what you do with the life they tried to make small. You are defined by the strength you find when no one is handing it to you. You are defined by the choice to keep going, to keep building, to keep believing in yourself even when the people who should have believed in you first chose not to. And that choice, that daily, unglamorous, often painful choice to keep going anyway, that is not nothing. That is everything. I am Sarah Calloway. I am 33 years old. And I am not useless. I never was. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment below and tell me your story. Tell me about the moment someone underestimated you, or the moment you stopped letting them. Tell me where you are right now. I read every comment in this community, and every single story shared here is proof that none of us are as alone as they made us feel. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you in the next one.